like to welcome you to NASA's 13th Annual Public Policy Day. That's the North American Securities Administrators Association. We're happy to be carried on C-SPAN television this afternoon with our panels. And I would ask that anybody who has a question or comment at the end of the panel should use the microphones that are in the audience. This panel is called The Downside of the Bull Market, Microcap Fraud, and I'm going to turn it over to the moderator, who is Douglas F. Wilburn, Commissioner of Securities for the State of Missouri. So without further ado, Doug.
Thank you, Frank. Again, my name is Doug Wilburn. I'm the Securities Commissioner for the State of Missouri. I'm joined today by a very distinguished panel to discuss the downside of the bull market, microcap fraud. To my left is Elizabeth Gray. Elizabeth is Assistant Director in the SEC's Division of Enforcement. To Elizabeth's left is Barry R. Goldsmith. Barry is an Executive Vice President of NASD Regulation, Inc. To Barry's left is Ralph Lambiase. Ralph is the Director of the Securities and Business Investments Division of the Connecticut Department of Banking. We expect to be joined shortly by Consuela Washington. Consuela is Minority Counsel for the U.S. House Committee on Commerce. As I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, and perhaps almost everybody in the country is aware, over the last several years, and even more so perhaps the last several months, we've experienced a huge bull market with rising stock prices. What perhaps people are not as aware of is the fact that our stock prices have experienced a bull market. We've also experienced a bull market in fraud, in stock fraud. State securities regulators estimate that securities fraud cost American investors nearly $10 billion a year. A significant portion of that fraud is found in what we refer to as the microcap market. The microcap market can be simply said, it's the over-the-counter trading in small, thinly traded securities of very low price. If you were to ask me what the upside of this microcap fraud market would be, what the silver lining in the dark cloud would be, it would be the joint regulatory effort that has come together to fight microcap fraud. A large portion of the cooperative effort is due to the efforts of people joining me today on this podium. I think you'll be impressed with the amount of effort each of these individuals, as well as their organizations, has put in to fight microcap fraud. And let me reintroduce Elizabeth Gray. Elizabeth is an Assistant Director in the SEC's Division of Enforcement. She is also the Chair of the SEC's Microcap Working Group. Elizabeth is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate from Dartmouth College, and she received her JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. Elizabeth?
Thank you, Doug. In a recent speech to the securities industry, SEC Chairman Arthur Levitt expressed zero tolerance for rogue brokerage firms. Reiterating what he had stated before the Senate when he testified last fall on microcap fraud, Chairman Levitt noted that boiler rooms belong in power plants, not in professional brokerage houses. With Chairman Levitt's leadership, the Commission is aggressively working to minimize microcap fraud with a four-pronged approach: examinations, targeted enforcement, regulatory initiatives, and investor education. The hallmark of the Commission's four-pronged approach is coordination, both within the Commission and with interested groups outside of the Commission, such as the states and the SROs. The Commission has created an internal microcap working group which brings together members of the various divisions at the Commission in order to identify and discuss specific issues relating to microcap fraud and to develop innovative responses to them. When the Division of Enforcement sees an emerging problem in the market for microcap securities, we do not only develop cases to prosecute such abuses, but also discuss with the Division of Corporation Finance possible regulatory modifications to a rule that we see being abused. We would do the same with respect to the Division of Market Regulation if we saw one of their rules being abused. In addition, the Commission's working group meets regularly with our counterparts in the states and the SROs to discuss our microcap programs, to receive feedback on possible regulatory initiatives, and to develop coordinated exam and enforcement efforts. The SEC is working with the states and the SROs to develop innovative and complementary exam programs and to repeat enforcement successes, such as Stratton-Oakmont, in which the states were able to use the Commission's injunction against the brokerage firm to pull the firm's license in certain states. The initial efforts of the Commission's Microcap Working Group, in conjunction with the Commission's operating divisions, culminated in the proposed amendments to Rule 15C211 and Form S8, as well as the final amendments to Regulation S, all of which the Commission approved at its open meeting on February 10th earlier this year. In considering all of these, the staff and the Commission has carefully weighed the goal of protecting investors with that of promoting opportunities for the small business community. Rule 15C211 requires market makers to review basic issuer information prior to publishing quotations for that issuer's securities. Under the current rule, market makers must have a reasonable basis for believing that the information is accurate, current, and from reliable sources. Once one market maker has published quotations for a security for at least 30 days, other market makers can publish quotations for that security without reviewing issuer information. The Commission's Microcap Working Group identified the need to reform 15C211 because quotations are often integral parts to fraudulent schemes involving microcap securities. For example, retail brokers hyping a microcap security may refer to a market maker's quotation when representing the security's value to a potential customer. Most significantly, the proposed amendments would require all market makers to review issuer information before initiating quotes for non-NASDAQ OTC securities. And this would eliminate what is called the piggyback exception, what I described earlier, when the later market makers can piggyback on the initial quotation. In addition, market makers publishing priced quotations would be required to update the information they have about the issuer annually. By requiring all market makers to review issuer information, the amendments are designed to deter these market makers from becoming knowing or unwitting participants in fraudulent schemes. The comment period for 15C211 recently expired. We have received a lot of comments, not all of which have been positive, and we are reviewing them now. We received a very thoughtful and supportive comment from NASA, and as would be expected, we appreciate that. The working group also identified abuses of certain registration exemptions and short forms as playing an integral role in microcap fraud. Form S8 is one of those. It is a short form Securities Act registration statement for offers and sales of securities to employees, consultants, and advisors for non-capital raising activities. The Division of Enforcement had increasingly observed abuses of Form S8. For example, some companies in the fraudulent promotion of microcap securities use Form S8 improperly to compensate consultants whose service to the company is promotion of the company's securities. In other cases, Form S8 has been used to distribute securities to the public through so-called consultants who's simply acting as a conduit for the public distribution of the stock. This latter practice was what was experienced in our case against Systems of Excellence, where it was a classic pump and dump scheme which we went into and suspended trading, did a TRO, and got a preliminary injunction and subsequent criminal indictments where really the stock got to the public through the abuse of Form S8. The proposed amendments to Form S8 make the form unavailable for sales to consultants and advisors who directly or indirectly promote or maintain a market for the company's stock, as was the case in Systems of Excellence. In addition, the proposed amendments require disclosure in the form of the name of any consultants or advisors to whom the stock will be issued, and also seeks comment on whether we should limit the aggregate percentage of securities that may be sold to consultants and advisors pursuant to Form S-8. We're reviewing the comments we've received on that, as well as the comment period also expired for that at the end of April. Final amendments were adopted by the Commission on February 10th as to Regulation S, which is a safe harbor from the registration requirements for offers and sales of securities by both foreign and domestic issuers that are made outside of the United States. The Commission adopted final amendments to stop the use of the provision to distribute stock in the United States without a registration statement. The amendments do this by classifying equity securities placed offshore by domestic issuers as restricted securities within the meaning of Rule 144, so that resales without registration or an exemption are restricted. In addition, the amendments lengthen the distribution compliance period, that is the period during which the stock has to stay overseas, to 1 year. Other regulatory initiatives that the Commission's Microcap Working Group has identified for future action are the penny stock rules, Rule 504 of Regulation D, and clearing brokers. Each of these provisions deals with a different segment of the market: the retail activities of the brokerage community, the offering process for small businesses, and generally larger brokerage firms that clear for smaller firms. In determining what modifications are needed to minimize abuses in these segments of the market, the Commission will balance the need for investor protection with that of promoting opportunities for small business and for competition. The Commission's targeted microcap enforcement and exam program is as strong as ever. Earlier this year, the Commission conducted a surprise sweep of microcap firms in New York. These and other for-cause exams provide a constant source of information about the street and help direct our enforcement resources where they are most needed. In addition, we are working with the criminal authorities like never before to put bad brokers not only out of the brokerage business, but behind bars as well. The assistance of the criminal authorities is invaluable, as the threat of jail time is often the only threat that convinces recidivists that it may be time to cooperate and shed light on the criminal activities in which they have participated. Our surveillance of the markets, in conjunction with the strong assistance provided by the NASD, as well as our surveillance of the Internet, is also a source of intelligence and investigations for our enforcement program. We are seeing more and more fraud involving microcap securities on the Internet, and I think that it will be a challenge to figure out how to allow the businesses to thrive on the Internet, and at the same time to keep control of the fraud that can be perpetrated through it. Finally, Chairman Levitt has made no secret about the importance he places on investor education. He has conducted over 25 town meetings to help educate the American investor, and has just last month conducted a nationwide town meeting in conjunction with many of you to get the word out that investors need to think about what they're doing before they invest. In his recent speech to the industry, Chairman Levitt applauded the NASD in its efforts to update the CRD, part of which is now accessible over the Internet. When fully implemented, it will present a great resource for the American investor to learn about their brokers and to do their part to help minimize microcap fraud.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Next up is Barry R. Goldsmith. Mr. Goldsmith is NASD Regulation, Inc.'s Executive Vice President for Enforcement. He serves as the organization's chief enforcement official responsible for formulating its national enforcement policy and overseeing its prosecution of disciplinary proceedings at both the national and district levels. Mr. Goldsmith graduated magna cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School in 1972, and he received his law degree from the Georgetown University Law Center in 1975. Barry.
Thank you, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and it's really a privilege to be part of this outstanding conference that's being put together by NASA. As Doug pointed out, we are in the midst of the longest sustained and most dramatic bull market in our history. And as with most good things, there's also a downside. And some investors, particularly first-time or inexperienced investors, perceive that everything in this market will continue to go up and up, and they let their guard down. And this enables some of these investors to become targets for the unscrupulous few in our industry and on the fringes of our industry who take advantage of the enormous positive optimism there is in the American investing public today. Fortunately, these problems are largely confined to the microcap market, as how Doug defined it previously. At NASD regulation, we are proposing and we are combating microcap fraud on 4 fronts. First, there will be stronger cooperative enforcement efforts with the states, the SEC, and criminal law enforcement agencies. Second, we will continue to bring major enforcement cases against the worst offenders in our industry. We will bring these cases not only against the firms and their principals, but we will drill down to the individual reps, the individual brokers who defraud the public. Third, we will continue to promote and propose aggressive new rules governing the over-the-counter market and the over-the-counter bulletin board, as well as regulatory initiatives governing the contacts between registered reps and their customers. And finally, and I reiterate Elizabeth's point that investor education is extremely important. We are going to strengthen our efforts to better inform investors about how to protect themselves from those who would take advantage of them. I'd like to briefly highlight some of the activities we are doing in each of these areas. With respect to fellow regulators and criminal authorities, NASD regulation has always had an excellent working relationship with the states, the SEC, and criminal law enforcement agencies. We've enjoyed many successes in the past, and we're working on what we hope will be many successes in the future. Over the past several months, we have been working with the SEC, the Enforcement Division, and OC to coordinate our examinations of problematic firms in the microcap area. We all have enough on our plates that regulatory coordination is a key to being effective in this area. With respect to criminal agencies, over the last year and a half, we have seen a significant increase in the number of requests that we're receiving for assistance around the country in microcap fraud cases. In response, we have this year formed a new unit within the Enforcement Department here in Washington to assist criminal law enforcement agencies investigate and prosecute securities fraud. This unit is called the Criminal Prosecution Assistance Group, and this group will be dedicated on a full-time basis to providing assistance to U.S. attorneys, state and local prosecutors throughout the country. This group will be in addition to our long ongoing efforts through our district offices with local law enforcement agencies. The second prong of our efforts to combat microcap fraud is in the area of bringing good, solid, big cases. Last year, NASD regulation instituted more than 1,000 new disciplinary actions. We barred 428 brokers from the industry, and the amount of disciplinary fines we collected increased by 30%. Some of our most significant cases were in the microcap area. This has been a target area of NASD regulation now for several years and will continue to be so in the future. I'd like to talk about a couple of these cases and then switch over to some of the rule proposals that we're working on. One recent case of interest is Monroe Parker. This was a case that is presently in litigation now. We filed at the end of last year. The case involved charges of price manipulation, excessive markups, and the firm's vice president, its vice president and head trader were also sued. The complaint alleges that during 1994 and 95, the firm acquired 94% of the inventory of a particular securities. In 6 days, they sold it out to the public at fraudulently excessive prices, and it is alleged in the complaint that the firm profited by more than $3 million from these fraudulent trades. This is an interesting case when you look at where the people in charge of the firm came from. As Elizabeth pointed out, Stratton Oakmont is a firm that the states barred from several states. The NASD expelled in 1996. The two principals of this firm came from Stratton Oakmont, and the manipulation that we charged in this complaint was the first piece of business that their new firm did. Another case, D.H. Blair, brought it in August of last year. It's a firm that some of you may be familiar with. This firm paid fines and restitution in a fraudulent markup case and fraudulent pricing activity of almost $5 million. Much of this money went back to investors in more than 40 states. One major change in our enforcement program, an area of emphasis, as I mentioned, is to drill down to the reps that deal with the public. This is particularly important because reps who have disciplinary histories should be under additional supervision. And as Elizabeth pointed out, as brokers' disciplinary histories become more accessible on CRD, it's going to be even more important to tag people with sales practice problems with violations. So when investors check out their broker, they'll know who they're dealing with. Other cases where we have drilled down, as I say, to the individual rep level, case involving GKN, a case involving 8 securities, fraudulent and excessive markups, more than $2.1 million, and restitution and fines in that case. In that case, we sued 25 individuals, and they all have been sanctioned. Stratton Oakmont, a firm that we expelled from the industry in 1996, barred its president and head trader. In October of last year, NASD Regulation filed a disciplinary action against 33 former principals and Stratton brokers, alleging a litany of serious sales practice abuses. The allegations in this case ran the gamut. You name it, it's in this case. One of the allegations dealt with a rep who continued to pursue a surgeon with high-pressure sales tactics and calls while he attempted to get back into the operating room. Other examples of multi-rep cases, H.J. Myers, 37 individuals, and A.R. Barron, 27. And this is something we are committed to in reaching the individual reps. The third prong of our attack on microcap fraud is the development of new rules. And as I mentioned before, the increase in fraudulent activity in our markets that we've seen has been dramatic in the microcap area and in the OTC and bulletin board. Unlike the NASDAQ stock market and other exchanges, stocks that trade in the OTC market and on the bulletin board are not subject to any listing standards, are not required to file any periodic reports with the SEC, are not subject to any minimum share price, and are not required to have financial statements subject to auditing standards. Many investors are confused, and some of them are deliberately confused, because the OTC bulletin board has the look and feel of a highly regulated market. It is not. It's fundamentally different from our listed markets. We have been working with the SEC to coordinate and harmonize our respective rule proposals in this area. In December of last year, our board approved for comment 3 very significant rule changes that we believe will materially affect the way securities are traded in the over-the-counter market. These rule proposals were put out for comment. The comment period expired on March 16th. And as Elizabeth said, with respect to the SEC rules, we received many, many comments from all perspectives on these rules. We're going through those comments, and we hope to go back to our board shortly with recommendations. The first rule proposal is called the eligibility rule, and this proposal, as originally formulated, would limit the over-the-counter bulletin board to companies that file periodic reports with the SEC and banks and insurance companies that provide current reports to their respective regulatory authorities. We believe that this rule proposal will encourage more issuers to become reporting and SEC filing companies and will significantly increase the amount of current information available to investors on these companies. The second rule proposal is what we call the recommendation rule. And this proposal would require brokers, before they recommend a transaction in an OTC security, to review current financial statements on the company that they are recommending. The third proposal, the disclosure rule, as originally proposed, would require that prior to the initial purchase of an OTC security, investors would receive a standard disclosure statement prepared by the NASD that would describe the nature of this market and the differences between the over-the-counter market and the listed market. We've received many comments on this rule, and we're currently looking at the best way and most effective way to deliver this disclosure. One interesting fact about this rule is that it would apply not only to solicited trades, but to unsolicited as well. And we're seeing a good deal of investor interest in some of the problematic stocks through electronic brokers and reputable discount brokers over the Internet. and we want these rule proposals to cover unsolicited trades as well. We have a taping rule that was recently approved by the SEC on April 17th, I believe. And our concern here is that when we put a firm out of business, the brokers may migrate to another firm, put out a sign, and open shop again. The taping rule, as approved, would require firms that have a certain percentage of brokers from firms that have either been expelled or sanctioned for sales practice abuses to tape all of their calls with customers for a period of 2 years. This rule, as I said, was approved by the SEC on April 17th. We're looking at other rule proposals in the cold calling area. We have a rule that was out for comment. The comment period is over, and we're sorting through those comments. And we're also looking at the possibility of obtaining some sort of trade or quote halt authority on the over-the-counter bulletin board. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize that the NASD is committed to providing a fair, well-regulated environment for the trading of all securities, even the most thinly capitalized stocks. We have made significant enhancements to investor protection, but as I think the group here has emphasized today, the key in doing more is to cooperate, to share our information, and to go forward and do the job together. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Next up is Ralph A. Lampiesi. Ralph is the Director of the Securities and Business Investments Division of the Connecticut Department of Banking. Mr. Lampiesi has long been active with the North American Securities Administrators Association. He currently serves as the chair of NASA's Broker-Dealer Operations Committee, and he has been involved in securities regulation for nearly 30 years. He is known to those that love him as, as the man that the industry loves to hate. Ralph Lampiesi.
Thank you very much, Doug, I think. I'm very honored to be here and represent, I think, the state regulatory enforcement perspectives and initiatives that have been carried out, and to discuss the sales practices problems that we found during the course of state examinations. To give you a scope, an idea of the scope of state regulation enforcement-wise, 1997 survey of 26 states had revealed that the states had initiated 3,600 investigations, that they had issued over 1,400 cease and desist orders, and that they had initiated 133 criminal actions. All right? In a 12-month period, the states had conducted over 1,000 examinations. I think it's very important to recognize that the examinations that the states conduct are what we call sales practice exams, and they're not duplicative of the examinations that are either conducted by the SEC, the NASD, the New York Stock Exchange, or other self-regulatory bodies. There are something like an estimated 6,000 branches that are out there. If you take a look at the total number of firms, which is something in excess of 5,600, you'll find that the particular market segment we're looking at is a very small segment of the industry. It is not reflective of the overall industry. However, it is a problem which is so significant that I think it will tend to ultimately cause a decline in integrity of the marketplace if it remains unchecked. Let me say that getting into sales practices, specific problems that the states found. If you want to know, let's say, how significant is the problem, in one particular branch office that the state regulators, and we have picked up this over the course of several years. So, I mean, you know, it'd be interesting to note that we didn't just start looking at microcap fraud. The investigations that and complaints that the states have reviewed have led us to understand that this problem is the same problem that we saw either in the 60s with penny stocks, etc. It just comes out in a new package, and it's continual problems. Now, the difference is the techniques are different, so you're reaching larger audiences. For example, one branch office that we looked at had 90 representatives, sales reps, in one office. They had 60 cold callers. Now, those 60 cold callers were responsible to make 300 calls a day. So you're looking at one branch office, 18,000 calls a day coming out of that branch office. All right? That is high pressure, and that is where you get your boiler room. Let's talk about some of the actual conduct on site when we're at the locations. we're seeing sales scripts. Now, sales scripts in and of themselves are not particularly a problem, but when the sales scripts are designed to teach cold callers and other people how to respond to the public inquiries, public questions, public concerns, the scripts are really intended to shift the focus away from the problem. Sure, we can send you information, but that'd be a waste of time because you're going to miss this investment opportunity now. And so what you're doing is you're forcing the public not even to get the opportunity to ask for and receive information to make an informed decision. In many cases, we have found that cold callers have told us under some questioning that they have, in fact, used multiple names. So they will use the name of a registered agent with no disciplinary problem. One particular individual told us that they had used up to 10 names of registered people. If any complaints came in on that registered individual, they shifted to one of the other names. All right? So, and the public has no understanding of this. If you look at generally the marketing program that the firms use, they'll use either a 3-call, 7-call method. They'll use glossy marketing materials. They'll push the idea that they're from New York City, which is the financial capital of the world. As a matter of fact, in some instances, we have found particular scripts that came from the New York City region which were directed to the Midwest region of the country. And in that, the script started out with, you know, I wish I could live in the country like you do. I wish I could live on a farm and be away from the stress of the cities. However, I am at the financial capital of the world. And this is where the financial conduct and information comes from. So if you want to do business with your local broker, then I suggest you have lunch with them, you have dinner with them, and even golf with them. Okay? But when it comes to financial decisions, you need to talk to us because we're here in New York City. That's a little unfair to New York City because that is the home for many, many fine firms. The other thing is we find that there's a tremendous amount of firms that use very impressive sounding names. You know, Royal such and such, Stratton such and such. They use these names which impress the heck out of me, I'll tell you. All right?
Did you give them your money?
Not yet. No, in the 60s, okay? And in the 60s is when I learned. We found a very interesting phenomenon at one of the firms in particular, that of all the agents that we looked at the firms, 80% of them, thank you, 80% of the individuals at the firm all had the title Senior President Sales. 80%, no, this is an actual case because we actually brought that in one of the on the sales practice side. 80% of the people, if you looked at the amount of time they were in business, it was less than 6 months on average. Because there is no standard, no industry standard, no regulatory requirement for the use of titles. Now, when the public call in and says, hi, my name is I'm with such and such, I'm a senior vice president at the firm. There's a reliance. Traditionally, they're not an officer of the firm. You don't have to be to have the title. The vice president of sales. As a matter of fact, it was interesting. One of the scripts that we found, people don't necessarily voluntarily turn them over. You have to be somewhat aggressive in getting them. But in particular scripts we found, the cold caller, the individual using that script, had, my name is, actually it said, hi, Mr. Smith. My name is, and then on the top of the script it said, you know, Dan Smith. And then it said, Dan's been in the business 4 years. Prior to that had worked such and such. So when we asked him, he said, well, this is mine. So we said, well, if it's yours, don't you know where you worked? Don't you know your name? You know? Again, that gets to the issue of scripts being passed out. Because actually they're handwritten so as to say that the firm says, I did not know that that was actually being used. Let's see what else we find. We found that in one case, this goes back about a year ago on one of the last series of the sweeps that the states have engaged in, we found a particular firm that had over 300 investor complaints at the branch. It was an extremely large branch with over 100 agents at the branch. But there were something like 300 complaints that the state examiners had found. And during the course of that, when you look to see into the system whether or not the complaints were reported, they weren't. So what you have is a branch that receives complaints, does not forward it on to the firm. There's no entry into the CRD system or to regulatory bodies to let them know that there are complaints. Therefore, the firm stays off the radar screen and below the regulatory review. Now, it was interesting, one of the individuals said, well, there might be more complaints, but we don't know. So the examiner I said, why? Why wouldn't you know this? And he said, well, someone came in the other day and stole a complaint file. Now, I have a tough time. I mean, of all the things, all the equipment and stuff available in the broad, to come in and steal a complaint file was, that was a first for me. I don't get too many more firsts, but that was one. Let's see, some of the other things. We find, on a more serious note, we find that there's a lot of what we call offshore accounts. All right, we find that when you look through the trading records of some of the firms at the branches, you'll find that there are people. In one case, we saw one individual make that $800,000 one day flipping over his position. But I've never, ever been anywhere nearly remotely that successful. And I don't think that the public has. But what you have to do is you have to look at the customer background, and you go to find out that the account was maintained offshore, what we call offshore U.S. scrutiny. And this is really an indication of perhaps some much, much more serious that's going on. It either could go into anything from laundering to other kind of criminal operation. We find that at branches, which is very important for us, as a matter of fact, that is the importance of the states. Look at this. We the use of consultants, many consultants. Some of the consultants had statutory disqualifications, but you remain in the business. They cannot get licensed, but they can remain in the business. Actually have one of the contracts for a consultant that, in this particular case, the examiners found, and when I say examiners, it's generic. It is not Connecticut only I'm talking about. I'm very proud to say that it's all the state. This is a collective summary of what they find. But in one particular one where I did get access to the contract, the individual who was, in fact, barred by us because he had prior felony, we would not license that individual. He was receiving $3,500 a month on a retainer to do training of 20 others, okay? And he was getting $500 each for every agent that went in, plus 5% of the business that they generated. Now, it just seemed to us when we questioned the firm about that, they just kind of indicated that, well, it does perhaps look a little bit excessive in terms of his compensation. That's more than most of us government people will make. But anyway, we find that consultants, undisclosed persons, we find whole branches, and this is, I'll leave you with this. We found entire branches, put a firm out of business. The agents in the particular location, you'll find that they have a tendency of moving or someone acquiring the entire branch. It's much easier for a firm to pick up an entire branch that's up and running with 50 agents, 20 cold callers, and something else, pick up that operation complete. The individual who's actually representing that branch likes the because they get no regulatory scrutiny. Because if you had a file to start a brokerage house, it gets state review, it gets other regulatory review and scrutiny, and it's somewhat costly. If you just have your entire branch picked up and then ultimately engaging in the same kind of conduct, you're at the very same location. All they do is say to the same customers, this very same customers, they're just simply saying, okay, we've now moved over here. They get the lists, they buy lists, and I wish I could say that if you only lost your money one time, that the public would be safe, but that is not the case. They actually sell the lists of what they call the losers, and they call them up. You know, it's true. They call them up, and what they'll do is they'll say, look, I know you took a loss on your first time out with this other firm that's now out of business, but I'm here to see that you can help recoup the losses that you've had. And unfortunately, that is a very sad thing because people rely on the marketplace and they would like to participate. They lack experience in the marketplace, which gets to the investor education issues. But clearly, I don't think that I think the public deserves and demands better from all of us within the industry and within the governments. I think that basically would conclude my comment.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Next up is Consuela M. Washington. Consuela is Minority Counsel for the House Committee on Commerce. Ms. Washington is responsible for legislation regulating the nation's securities markets and oversight of the securities industry. Ms. Washington is a 1973 graduate of the Harvard School of Law. Consuela?
Thank you. And I apologize for being semi-talk, but we're in the middle of a major fire drill. The banking bill is being brought back to the floor this week. As you know, my boss has an amendment filed playing Major League Poker with the Republican leadership and has indicated that he will only support the bill, refuse to stop trying to block it, if they accept his amendments. One part of that amendment, as you may know, is a piece to protect your ongoing securities fraud enforcement jurisdiction. The banks, surprise, surprise, tried to get a preemption piece built into it that would have knocked you guys out of business and the state insurance regulators. Bad, bad. In any event, on to microcap fraud. In December of last year, the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations held a hearing on this very subject. And in December, as you know, Business Week carried a major cover story titled Rip Off, which caught the attention of my boss. And so shortly thereafter, two dinglegrams flew out of the buildings, one to the Department of Justice, SEC, the NASD, and to the states, asking, what have you done about this outrage? What do you intend to do? And to make sure that everybody was honest and actually did the things that he knew that they were going to promise they were going to do, he asked the GAO to do a major series of reports updating the work that they'd previously done on stock fraud and broker practices, and then on a going forward basis to look at the responses that came in from the regulators and give us some recommendations also on the specific issues related to microcap fraud. We always use the GAO as sort of the shotgun behind the door. We believe that everybody's really going to clean up and do the things that they really should be doing, but just to make sure, we order a GAO report. Nobody likes to look bad in a GAO report. So we know that everybody will scurry around and clean up house before GAO reports come out. In fact, we met with GAO several weeks ago, and they indicated that they would be coming up to the Hill with an oral report in May, and hopefully a final written report in June on those parts that are merely updating the stock and broker-dealer sales practices recommendations to see that they've been carried out and whether they've been effective. It will be a while before they go back and are able to pick up on and come forward with doing some major work that's just microcap fraud specific. Dingle put a letter out on March 16th releasing the responses from the regulators, and all of this correspondence is on our webpage. I assume you have access to it or it's otherwise been provided to you. I will only indicate that from my boss's perspective, I'm a little disappointed not to any longer be chairman of the Oversight Investigation Subcommittee, because he would have loved to have had you testify on the record about your findings. But we've sort of figured out that as long as we still have our word processors and the press cares about what we say, we can do indirectly that which we used to do directly. So the crooks are aware of the fact that we are looking, that we are pressing the government entities and you guys to continue to do that which you do so well, and to encourage the Justice Department to put more guys in the slammer. The problem with slapping these guys with fines is that it's the cost of doing business. And unless they get put in prison for some decent time, and one of the things we will be recommending is better sentences for these people and not at these nice swishy little facilities where they can lift weights and play tennis and golf. We want them to think about the horrible things that they've done, stealing money from people who really can't afford to lose their savings. I'm going to cut my part of this short because I've been told that there will be questions from the audience, and I'd rather that than me drone on, but that gives you an idea of where we're coming from, and we support you guys 150%.
Thank you, Consuela. We do have time for a couple of questions. And I'd remind you, the gentleman in the back, to use the microphone that's provided here by C-SPAN.
Barry.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Joe Borg, Alabama. Barry, on the issue of the stealing of money, I'm going to call it like I said, stealing of money by the microcaps. One of the things, the initiatives that the states have started, is to try and cut it off before listed. In other words, working with classifications and listings at NASDAQ. And as you know, in a recent project, we've been successful of getting a few issues rejected by NASDAQ. And it took a combination of state, NASDR, and SEC information to do that. Has there been more thought about expanding this rather than just letting the states do it, pretty much coming from us to you? Has there been thought about increasing this so we can blow out the match instead of having to put out a raging fire?
Well, I'm not affiliated with NASDAQ, thanks to the SEC, but they have taken a very aggressive position, increasingly aggressive position on their listing standards, not only increasing them and toughening them, but qualitatively considering things like the state actions. And I think that the way it's working thus far, at least the cases that you and I are familiar with, it's proven to be successful. I know that they are very receptive to getting information from the states and other regulators about underwriters and issuers that are trying to list on their markets.
Yes, well, let me ask you this now. Because of the differentiation NASDR and NASDQ, I'm finding that there's a lack of communication between the two. And the information that I may give to NASDAQ is already available from NASDR, but it's not getting from NASDR to NASDAQ, or there seems to be some wall there that apparently the information is not going. And unfortunately, going through a third party like us, rather than saying, hey, we got that, why don't you take it to NASDAQ and let them know these are the principles, these are the firms, these are the problems, and this is the history. And it seems to me communication line could be increased. We, one, cut a lot of time, be more efficient, and could reallocate our resources to make it more effective.
I think that's a good suggestion, and we do communicate with both listing investigations and new listings, and I think you're right. I think we could improve that communication and expedite things.
Anyone else? Could you also identify yourself, please?
Yeah, Jim Irvin with the Rights Commission. Quinzel, one of the issues, and we've heard about it this morning, is trying to get stricter enforcement and such. Does Congress have the will to stiffen penalties? You had made mention putting people in jail and not in country clubs. What can we do to A, stiffen penalties, or B, toughen up penitentiaries? Because that, I think, is determined to be a deterrent, at least in states, and we're going to need federal help on that, and hopefully Congress something like that. Is there any will to do that yet?
It's like this. If I had the gavel, no. It becomes, it requires some political adeptness to answer. I would you to do two things. One, GAO will be coming out with what I hope will be a report on this, and I would encourage you to get your comments in that regard to Tom Poole and or Mike Burnett down at GAO to make sure that that's something that you believe is really important. In terms of the Congress, which will respond to the GAO report, that particular subject is the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee. The committee does not have jurisdiction over prisons or the sentencing guidelines. That is the Judiciary Committee. And again, I would encourage you to encourage them to move in that area because you need help. And that it's very important to their constituents that these people be put away for a long time.
I'll add to that because I think Kendall, probably the commissioner from New York, said it once very well. He said it's much more of a deterrent show them Attica than perhaps a country club federal. So that if we could, perhaps sending these people to state prisons, I know in Missouri it's not a picnic. So
Well, we prefer two. Don't have jurisdiction. jurisdiction, and the federal will supersede state. You don't always necessarily get the state conviction. You get the federal conviction, which is in federal prison versus state prisons. And I much prefer them in the state prison. They seem to be a lot tougher there.
Now, I agree with you 150%. You know that there's legislation moving through Congress that we probably will not be able to stop. Litigation Reform Part 2, which is going to require defrauded investors class action lawsuits. And usually people of modest means have to go the class action route. They can't afford to litigate these things standing alone on their own, to file suits in the federal court. No more recourse to the state court once this goes through. And unless, you know, state regulators are bringing actions in the state courts, you're not going to get these people in state prisons, which are, I know, tougher prisons than the federal prisons.
You know, it's interesting to note that the Attorney General for the state, I think earlier this year held public hearings in the matter of microcap fraud. And that office does have the criminal jurisdiction, and it has, I know, geared up its efforts to help deal with the problems that are coming out of New York, which is giving it a bad name. And I think that as you see more criminal state law enforcement bodies moving in this area, I think you will see criminal actions.
Because a lot of these guys are recidivists. I remember when I went through the responses I got to my chairman from the regulators, a lot of these people's names look really familiar. I said, geez, aren't these the guys who, you know, and they just keep cropping up. I mean, you need a good prison sentence, you know, sort of function like a roach motel, you know, if they go in and stick a while, maybe get them off the streets.
Just getting them off the streets, though, won't do. We've seen a couple of cases where people have actually orchestrated manipulation from the slammer, yeah, cell phones and all. It's,
I think we have time for just a couple more questions.
That's amazing.
Ron Thomas, Director of the Virginia Securities Commission. My question is for Ms. Gray. What areas is the SEC going to be looking at for Reg D Rule 504?
We're going to look at the rule as a whole and see whether we can identify how it's being abused and how we can close that loophole if it is. We have seen abuses. We brought cases of investigation. Nietzsche Capital is one case that comes to mind where there are abuses. 504, where the stock, we have seen abuses in the offering process. People are misled when they receive the securities about the company, you know, sort of a classic offering fraud. And we've seen it then get stock that's not restricted out into the public, manipulated both ways. We've reached out to the small business community to get the sense of their reaction of making an offer to manipulate the stock, which would probably be, you know, the possibility is to restrict the stock. And I think people generally were receptive to keeping this offering available, this exemption available, but making it harder to abuse. There really wasn't that much resistance to it.
Does the thought process also entail the possibility of requiring at least registration in one state jurisdiction?
That's also a possibility, and that really addresses the offering fraud part, which I do believe is the problem.
Thank you.
Yes, this gentleman over here.
Jerry Friday with NASDAQ. Is there an opportunity whereby the SEC may be able to share some information regarding pending enforcement actions with listing qualifications? We have hurdles in that area that make it somewhat difficult for us to share that information. If it was available to us, it would help enhance our ability to carry out our obligations to protect the investors and the public interest.
Probably a very tricky question that I don't know the answer to. I think it is an important issue. I know it has come up. I would say that there is, at the very least, an effort. If we know a stock is about to, there's an application to get it listed on NASDAQ, the first thing I would do would be to call my old boss, who's now over there, Gary Sundick, and say, are you guys going to list this? Don't you see A, B, C, D, and E that looks kind of suspicious, which doesn't require me to do any revelation necessarily than looking at in the public and sort of giving a heads up that way without getting into any investigative files. In terms of the actual turning over of information, I really don't know what the actual obstacles are, and it's something that we should discuss.
I think we have time for just one more question.
I wanted to know whether the SEC, the states, and the NASD are coordinating their surveillance on the internet as far as coverage, kind of thing.
Well, I will address what we try to do on the internet, which is a lot of different people in the staff of the Division of Enforcement at the SEC who, on a very part-time basis, will go into the internet and look for frauds that are going on. We also have a page where people write in complaints, and we review all of the complaints that come in, which could provide us with enough work to keep us all busy for a while, just based on sorting through the complaints and looking at what's out there. I don't know how much we actually talk to your guys who are...
I think divide the internet up into 3 equal equal parts. It's really, we have a surveillance system that we're just getting off the ground called NetWatch, which is an automated internet surveillance system, but it's that real-time surveillance generally. But what we do or have done in the past is when we're looking at a particular situation, we will look at that portion of the internet that pertains to the situation. The new automated surveillance system will be looking at the internet as a whole, constantly looking for changes in internet traffic, market breaks, so to speak, with respect to internet traffic. But we certainly share the information we get, but it's not a coordinated surveillance of the internet, so to speak.
I think what we are seeing more and more is if you're going to find microcap fraud on the internet, you're going to get arrows coming in from all different directions you to it. You'll get NASD surveillance may call us with a stock being manipulated that we, through our internet, have had several complaints on, and from one of our guys out there looking for fraud on the internet will see it. Because I think a mechanism, it seems to be showing up more and more, mechanism that's used in microcap is a cheap way to get your message out.
Well, and I'd like to echo what Elizabeth and Barry said, because this morning we had a meeting, the SEC and the NASD and the states, concerning coordinating our enforcement efforts and discussed the internet specifically, and had a presentation done by a gentleman who's heading the NASDR's effort in this area. Additionally, New York Stock Exchange, along with the Amex, the CBOE, the Chicago Options Exchange, the SEC in the states, and the NASD are putting on joint training this summer, and one of the topics that we'll be dealing with will be, in fact, the internet, and we'll all put our heads together and figure out how we can combat it.